Hello. So, Bertrand Russell gave this analogy about a teapot as a way to explain who has the burden of proof. Russell asks us to imagine some guy who claims that there's a teapot orbiting the sun between Earth and Mars. This teapot is too small for us to see, and since we can't journey out into space, Russell wrote this in the 1950s, there's no way to verify or refute the claim. Ah, says Russell's imaginary man, since you can't prove that the teapot isn't there, you must assume that it is. Since it would be ridiculous to conclude that Russell's teapot exists simply because we can't prove that it's not there, the burden of proof, Russell or an atheist who is regurgitating this analogy in some form or another argues, is on the person claiming the teapot exists, i.e. the theist, who claims that God exists. Since the default assumption is that no such teapot exists, the person claiming that the teapot exists is the one who has to provide evidence of that claim. Positive evidence for us to believe in the teapot. He can't just insist that we accept his belief as the default position. Basically, the analogy says that since we can't prove God's existence through observation, we should assume that God doesn't exist until we're given reason to believe otherwise. And the burden of proof, therefore, is on the theist. It's true that it's impossible to prove a negative. In order to prove that some object or phenomenon doesn't exist, you would need to have knowledge of every point, every area at all times in the universe, which we don't because we are human, we are finite, but we can give reasons why we believe something doesn't exist. We have no reason to believe that matter would randomly arrange itself to resemble a teapot. We know of no missions to space where humans have reported seeing any such thing, an orbiting teapot. Thus, if someone claims that there is a teapot in orbit, the theist can agree with Russell that the burden of proof is on that person to provide positive reasons for the claim, but where the analogy falls apart is in the assumption that atheism is the appropriate starting point or default position for human reasoning about God. Historically, the vast majority of humanity believed in some form of divinity. They believed that there is a God or gods. Even if they didn't believe in the Judeo-Christian God specifically, the fact that God exists is one that is imprinted on the human mind. It's imprinted on the nature of reality. Belief in the divine, then, seems to be the place human rationality naturally takes us. Thus, the burden of proof is on the atheist to explain why we should deny the natural, logical leanings of our minds. Why should I accept that atheism is true? The flying spaghetti monster is a version of Russell's teapot. Pastafarianism is a religion created by a smarty pants named Bobby Henderson. He created it in protest of the Kansas State Board of Education's decision to teach intelligent design as an alternative to the theory of evolution. His idea being, if such foolishness as intelligent design can be taught alongside the theory of evolution, if it has to be given equal time in schools, why can't other foolishness be taught? His point was that to teach intelligent design was absurd as teaching that a flying spaghetti monster created all things and deceived scientists into believing evolution. Here's the line of reasoning for the flying spaghetti monster. Premise 1. There is no evidence for the existence of the Judeo-Christian God. Premise 2. There is no evidence for the existence of the flying spaghetti monster. Conclusion. Belief in the Judeo-Christian God and belief in the flying spaghetti monster are on equal epistemic grounds. Here's the thing. Premise 1 is false. It just isn't the case that there is no evidence for the Judeo-Christian God. Henderson and atheists alike may not be convinced of the evidence. They may not accept it. That's really no one's concern. And not much is offered by way of demonstrating that the classical, contemporary evidences for God, for God's existence, are false. And even if you could refute several of the arguments for belief in God, you still wouldn't be justified in saying that there is no evidence for the existence of God. Such a comment stinks of an a priori rejection. That is, a rejection of the evidence before the evidence is even given. There are many avenues of evidence for God's existence. There are cosmological arguments, arguments for a first cause, teleological arguments, arguments for a grand designer, moral arguments, arguments for a moral lawgiver, etc. Anyone who's serious about the question of whether or not God exists has to deal with these arguments before dogmatically rejecting the existence of God. To ignorantly reject these arguments because you have no good reason to believe in God isn't in matching with the most influential thinkers in Western civilization. Almost all major philosophers and thinkers have dealt with the existence of God, and many, if not most, accepted some form of a belief in God. It's a small minority of thinkers who have denied the existence of God. Pause though, I'm not saying that because so many people have come to the conclusion that there is a God, that therefore then God is true. That would be fallacious. It's simply a fact that many brilliant minds have pondered the God question and have come to the conclusion that in fact he does exist. Doesn't prove that God exists, but it should prompt us to deal with the question seriously and honestly. Here are some contrasts between belief in the Judeo-Christian God and the flying spaghetti monster. Belief in God. Prevalent among all peoples of all times. Atheism is very rare. Even atheists admit this. 2. There are many sophisticated philosophical arguments for God's existence. 3. The Christian God is a coherent explanation of why something exists rather than nothing, why logic is prescriptive and universal, why morality is objective, and why religion is ubiquitous. 4. Belief in God is rationally satisfying. Belief in the flying spaghetti monster, believed by no one, even the so-called advocates of flying spaghetti monsterism. They don't really believe that it exists. It's a joke. There are no technical or philosophical arguments for the flying spaghetti monster. There are no arguments of any kind. Even those who will sarcastically espouse the existence of the flying spaghetti monster don't find it to be a coherent explanation to logic or morality and beauty, etc. Even if they did, it wouldn't be rationally satisfying, because it's not rational. There are some atheists who actually take theistic arguments seriously. Online, though, at least, in my experience back and forth with self-professed atheists, they don't seem to take the argument seriously. It's like they ask the same questions over and over again, like they have a handbook, which they do. This can be seen in popular atheistic texts, like the Atheist Debater's Handbook, or The God Delusion. Such texts refute weak, incomplete arguments for theism and suppose that they have refuted theism and the actual fully reasoned arguments themselves that Christian philosophers and theologians give. That's what it means to be intellectually dishonest. In short, the difference between belief in the Judeo-Christian God and belief in the flying spaghetti monster or the flying pink unicorn or the teapot is this. Belief in God is rational, and it's supported by sound reasons. Belief in the flying spaghetti monster is irrational. It is not supported by any good reasons. Henderson simply begs the question when he says there are no good reasons for belief in God. Christianity is a reasonable and defensible religion. There are difficult questions that we must ask ourselves. as Christians, but the fact that there are difficult questions is not grounds for dismissing Christianity. Our pursuit, as believers and non-believers, of truth, of the answers to our own deep-seated spiritual questions, draws every one of us into the intellectual richness of Christianity, of Christ. Right! My name is Christ Defender. I defend the Christian faith. I answer questions and criticisms concerning Christianity. If you like what I do and you would like to support me, hit the Patreon link in the description below. If you're not too sure yet, but you're intrigued, hit subscribe, turn on notifications, check me out. Okay, bye!